Hello, what's your name?
My name is Alan Menter.
Good evening. This is the 25th of November, 2013, and we're interviewing Dr. Alan Menter as part of the Roots to Boots project for the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. Dr. Menter, I'd like to start with asking you to please tell us about the historical origins of your family, where they came from in Europe before coming to South Africa.
Well, I know my mother's rather well because we've done a whole encyclopedic review of my mother's history. And my mother's great-grandfather came from Vilnius in Lithuania.
Wait, oh, I'm sorry, where?
Vilnius.
Vilnius in Lithuania. Came from Vilnius in Lithuania. He was one of 13 brothers, of whom 10 happened to be doctors, and I've got pictures of them back in 1870. Anyway, the family, part of them migrated to Europe, part migrated to Ireland, part migrated to Manchester and Newcastle. And my mom grew up in Dublin, Ireland. She was one of about 100 Jewish families in Dublin, Ireland. And then my late father, who sadly died when I was 19, he went to Dublin to do medicine from South Africa. And he was a third generation, also obviously from the Lithuanian region, but I don't have his history as coordinated as well as I do my mother's. He met my mom in 1939 while at medical school in Dublin at Trinity. And then when he was and they got married. And then I was born during the war in Yorkshire in England when he was doing a locum there. And after the war, we all went back to South Africa. So that's kind of the origins of the family. And the name was changed, obviously, over the years. It was Rubenstein initially, and to my mother's name, and then it was changed in Ireland to Green. And her best friend, actually, growing up, interestingly, was the son of the only rabbi in Dublin. And the rabbi's name was Herzog, and the son's name was Chaim Herzog. So Chaim Herzog went, when his father, Rabbi Herzog, was chosen to be chief rabbi of London in the early 40s. Chaim went from Israel with his dad, joined the British Secret Service, and then at 48 went to Israel and became president of Israel thereafter. So that's a little brief history from my mother's side.
So, how many children are in your family?
My wife and I have 4 children.
No, I mean in your the parental family that.
My mother's family, my father had one sister who, as I said, my dad died when I was young. My aunt kind of almost took care of the 4 Menter brothers. I was one of 4 boys.
Okay, you were one of
with
4
my
boys.
mother. And my mother had 3 siblings, one sister, and who's actually still living in Dublin at the age of 90, and 2 brothers who have passed away.
And then you were one of 4 children.
I was one of 4 children. I was the only one born outside of South Africa. So when we went back to South Africa, the rest were born the other 3 were born in South Africa. And then I got married when I was 25, and then Pam and I have had 4 children. Excuse me, 3 children. Pam and I have had 3 children.
Tell me about your early life in South Africa, what it was like growing up there.
Well, it was sadly, it was a fairly idyllic type of relationship. We sadly all, just like the South here, we all had servants growing up. In fact, when my dad died, we had a wonderful guy. His name was Elias. He was a black gentleman who did everything for us. He was almost like a second father to us, but he couldn't live with us. So the apartheid era was something I was always very concerned about, upset about, and all of us at university were very much part of the anti-apartheid movement. We had something there called the Student Representative Council, which was considered by the government, the Afrikaner government, which was obviously the pro-apartheid government. It was considered communist, like many people here who were, anti, the mainstream were considered communist. But I enjoyed every minute of growing up. I played, all of us were very much into soccer and rugby and all the other things that South Africans like to enjoy. So it was a very idyllic period growing up, provided one stayed away from the sad apartheid era.
Were you in a public school environment, or was it a private
Totally
school?
public school. very few of my friends went to private schools. The governmental public schools were superb. We had every facility, even in the 50s when I was in when I was in elementary school, and then in the I graduated from high school in 1958. I mean, we had every facility. We had multiple sports grounds, we had art schools, we had swimming pools. So a lot of money was given by the government and by the local, school districts to education. Sadly, again, it was apartheid. It was only white kids who were allowed in the school.
What was Jewish community life like?
Very strong. The Jewish community life in South Africa was as strong as it is in Dallas growing up. I mean, we had Habonim, we had B'nai Zion, we all went to shul. My mom was very, very, very orthodox. I never ate treif, I never ate anything. I never had anything that related to pork until we went to England, when my wife and I migrated to England for a few years. So it was a very orthodox upbringing. My father himself was not very orthodox, but my mother was. And we went to shul every week. We went to, every possible affair. As I said, every Sunday morning we went to Habonim or B'nai Zion. And the 4 Menter brothers all grew up that way.
Tell us how you met your wife.
Well, I was in medical school and Pam was in nursing school. She grew up in Zambia, and she basically came to nursing college after high school, and she was part of the groups, all the doctors and medical students, and socially she was part of a big social group that I knew some of the people, and one day I called her up to invite her out, and 6 years later we got married. We got married in Temple Shalom, and actually the rabbi who married us is now in Australia. So then we lived there. We got married in 1966, had our first 2 kids, one in 68, and then, as I said, we went to, in 71, in 70 we had our second son, and then I had a scholarship to go to London for a couple of years. And we went to London in 1971, December 71, and then in July of 73 we decided to come back to South Africa, and we took a Land Rover, rather stupidly I suppose. My mother wasn't happy with us, with our 2 little kids who were 5 and 3, and drove from London back to Johannesburg for 6 months across the whole of Africa, which was, as my mother would say, was sugar.
That must have been an incredible experience.
It was incredible. We had no cell phones in those days. We had nothing, just powdered food, which we found water for and cooked over an open fire whenever we could find it.
What was your most memorable experience of that trip?
Probably the Sahara Desert. We took our time. We had, we had very little money in those days, but it didn't cost us very much except for petrol or gas. And we had a lot of Land Rover spare parts, and we could swap that because Land Rover parts were so sought after in Africa. So probably the best experience we had was crisscrossing across the Sahara Desert, looking for old caves with cave paintings, which was truly spectacular. And then watching the kids climb the sand dunes in the Sahara Desert. So, and then actually staying in huts in places we went to. We met the local tribes people, and I gave out free medicines which I brought with me, and they put us up in little huts, and getting to know the local people wherever we went, and the different tribal traditions and the different tribal dresses, and dressing our kids in little traditional African costumes. And not having a haircut for 6 months was kind of fun as well. So
I bet that's an experience
it was
your
quite an
children will never
experience. It
forget.
really was. Yeah, we've got a wonderful scrapbook, and we took recordings of the kids, so every now and again with their British accents in those days. So we play it back, and then I had an opportunity to come to UT Southwestern shortly after I arrived back in December. I got an opportunity to come here. So we came for 2 years, and 37 years later we're still here.
So that's what brought you to Dallas, was the UT Southwestern.
Yeah, there was a fellowship teaching program there, and the dermatology program was just starting. So I came and loved every minute of it, and we felt it was a good place to bring up our kids. So we fortunately came with the green card, so we were eligible to stay, from the beginning.
Mhm.
So our kids have grown up here. They have we go back. Our son, Colin, who was 3 when we arrived back in South Africa from our trip, he barely had any memories of anything relating to South Africa, but he wanted to do anthropology all his life. So once he qualified in university with an anthropology degree, he went back to Africa for a year, and 15 years later he's still working there.
Really?
As an anthropologist. Yeah, there's a World Heritage Site there called the Cradle of Humanity, which is a few million years origin, and he works there and teaches there and digs there.
Wow.
So things go in full circle.
So when you came to Dallas, did you know anybody here from South Africa?
There was
prior
only
to your
one
arrival?
family we knew here, and that was Eddie and Sandra Melman. And
Mhm.
Eddie was a few years ahead of me at medical school, and we had just talked to him about coming here, and very kindly he allowed us to stay with our 3 little kids in his house, Eddie and Sandra, and they had kids. We stayed with them for a couple of weeks before we found our own little house. But that was the only South Africans we knew when we arrived in August of 75.
And what were your first impressions of the Jewish community in Dallas when you arrived?
Well, we soon, thanks to Eddie had sisters that were part of the Jewish community here, and Sandra was very involved, so we got to know them fairly quickly, and we basically, I played tennis with a lot of them. I was obviously very involved in my work, and I chaired one year with one of my medical colleagues, the doctors division of I think it was the AJC for fundraising. So I got very involved very early, very, very, very early on. Richard Saxton was the other guy who co-chaired everything with me then. So I think that was within the first 5 years I got involved, and we joined Temple Shalom fairly early, and all the kids were bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah there at Temple Shalom.
Did your wife find it as easier to integrate into the community?
I think she did. I mean, she obviously got, had the 3 little kids to take care of, and but she got very involved. She started a book club very early, which is still going strong. She's a big bridge player, so she got involved in that area fairly quickly.
Were there any significant differences that you found between the South African Jewish community and the Dallas Jewish community?
Good question. Very, very good question. Tremendous amount of similarities. I mean, everybody knew everybody else. A lot of people gave a lot back to the community in both places. The big difference really was that whereas the Jewish community here gives to Israel a lot, they give a lot within the Dallas area, whereas South African Jewry gave almost everything they gave something to the local community, like sponsoring kids to B'nai Zion and Habonim and the shuls. But they were, I think, per capita, the South African community gave more to Israel than anybody else around the world. Israel was very much a greater part of their living, whereas here, obviously everybody's very comfortable living here, whereas we were not all that comfortable living in South Africa. Hence I think a lot of the functions that were done were to raise money for Israel. But when we arrived here, for instance, Dallas, coming from London, was a very small town.
Mm-hmm.
In 75. We had, I think, £100 left in the bank, in our bank in London, which was a lot of money for us in those days. And I went to the local bank here, and I asked for them to transfer the money, and they couldn't do it. They had to send me downtown to get the money transferred. So it was a small, there was very few people from outside of Dallas, let alone quote-unquote foreigners from Europe or from Africa that were here. But it grew. We've loved Dallas ever since we arrived. It's grown up as a big community, and yet it's got many, many features that make it a smaller community without being overly busy.
Are there any particular traditions or South African traditions that you've brought with you from your homeland to Dallas that you still practice that might be, that we might not know about?
South African traditions that were not known about, or
That we don't
not known
know
about
about.
here in Dallas.
From the Jewish community in particular, I mean, anything different that you might do? Any
Really,
specific foods?
the communities are very, very, very similar. I mean, very, very, very similar. I don't think there's a single aspect of our upbringing or our adult lives in South Africa that were not very similar to what we found here, really. I mean, outside of the fact that everybody wanted to go to Israel at an early age, I think that was probably something that was, I mean, the sporting way of life there was very different, obviously. You know, everybody was committed massively to rugby, which was the national sport. There was obviously here, that aspect of it is not a significant part of one's life. From a religious perspective, we certainly didn't have the array of what we call shuls, temples. There we just had the one Orthodox shul and then the one Reform. So we didn't have, I mean, Johannesburg's a big city, and there was a fairly large Jewish population in Johannesburg, probably even more numbers than we had in Dallas when we arrived. So it was a smaller community that we arrived, but I think from a traditional perspective, things were very, very similar.
Do you miss South Africa?
Not really. I love living here. I mean, as I said, we've lived here since 1975. The one thing I do miss, I think every South African probably misses, is the ability just on a weekend to go to the game park and veg out, as we would call it, and get away from everything and watch the animals in a Land Rover for 6 hours a day and go to bed at 10 o'clock at night without TV, without cell phones, and get away from, the hustle and bustle of everyday life. So we go there, like Pam grew up in Zambia last year. This year was her 70th birthday, and she hadn't been back for 52 years. So our son arranged for us to go on an 8-day game-watching trip in Zambia, her home country, and we went to 2 spectacular new game parks, saw every animal you could ever wish to see with nobody there. So that is an experience that I think, and all our American friends and European friends that we've gone with over the years, just, I think, find it a very major, some people call it life-changing. It really is. So that's
so
the
you
only
traveled
thing.
back to South Africa
Not
several times?
as much as we used to, with the kids here and our 2 little grandkids that we now have. So, I mean, I travel a couple 100,000 miles every year for my work. So sometimes there's conferences there in South Africa, and Pam will come with me if it's going to be, more than a couple of days. And so between us, we've gone back, I would think, probably every other year. Whether that'll continue, obviously one day if we live long enough, we'd love to, when the kids are teenagers, our 2 little grandkids are 3 and 8 months old, we would probably love to take them there, but I don't think it's worthwhile taking little kids there at this stage until they can understand it.
I understand. Were there particular foods that you enjoyed there that are different from what we have here?
Yeah, I think there's very traditional Dutch kind of food, and also from different parts. I mean, South Africa has a pretty diverse community, people from different parts of the world. So there's a very thriving kind of food rituals there, one of which is a jerky called biltong, which every South African lives. Then there's the equivalent of the barbecue is called the braai. Braai means to burn. Vlees is meat, and it's a very similar open fire, but very different, very different cooking utensils, very different food. They have big sausages, which they call boerewors. Wors means sausage. Boere is from the Afrikaner background, and the meats and things are all very, very different. So, to some extent, most South Africans, I think, probably would love to have. And there are local people around the country who try to bring those kind of dishes to the US, but the meat is not the same because it's derived from antelope, from deer. That's very, very different to what we have here. And
Is the biltong made from deer? Is it
oh yeah,
it's
it is
made
from
deer?
impala, from springbok. Springbok is the national deer of South Africa. And when you represent your country in a sport, it's called, you're called a springbok.
So you were
springbok.
able to check the deer and get the kosher biltong?
There was. I'll tell you a funny story about the kosher side of things. I mentioned that my mom was very, very orthodox, and she made the best chopped liver, I think, of anybody and that we knew of, and everybody used to clamour to get my mother's chopped liver. So every year before Pesach, she would send me on my bicycle to go to the one and only Jewish butchery there to get the liver so she could make it. So I was about 14 or 15, and I stopped to go play some sport on my way to them. By the time I got there, he had no liver left, absolutely no liver left. So I said, what am I going to do? My mother will kill me if I don't come home with liver so she can make chopped liver for Seder tomorrow night. So he said, I'll tell you what we'll do, Alan. He said, don't ever tell your mother this. He says, I'll send you to a good friend of mine who has a butcher around the corner. And I did not know that this was not a kosher butchery. And so I got the liver and I brought it back to my mum. And he said, don't tell your mother where you got it. It took me 20 years before I finally owned up that I had bought non-kosher liver for my mother. So that was, but as I said, when we went to London for my 2 years of fellowship, and we went to London in 71, the very first, I was 30 years of age before we ever tasted anything that was pork related. Never had bacon until we went to London at age 30.
What are the names of your children?
Keith, named after my late father. Colin, named after my grandfather. And Kerith, which is a name that Pam found in, what was the name of the book? K-R-I-T-H. In one of the famous Jewish books, was an old Jewish name called Kerith. So Keith, Colin, and Kerith.
And which is the one that's living in Africa?
That's Colin, that's the second son. He's the one who lives in Africa.
And
He now spends, he married a South African physician actually, and she spends half her time working in Canada, so he spends half his time doing research at some of the universities in Canada, then takes all the students back with him to Africa.
And where in Africa is he working?
At the Cradle of Humanity, which is a World Heritage Site between Johannesburg and Pretoria.
Okay, and what are the other children doing?
Keith, the eldest, is a philosopher, writer, and he went to school here locally. And the two boys, when we arrived as I said, in 75, busing had just started here, and we were very much anti-apartheid, so we said we're not going to go to a private school, which we didn't, and the kids were bused. And when they went to, Keith and Colin were bused, when they went to junior high, they said they couldn't take the gang warfare that was going on there. So that's when they went to private school to St. Mark's. And so Keith played tennis through high school, played tennis in college at William and Mary, and then now coaches tennis part-time and writes essays, books, etc. Whereas Colin is more the scientist from from an anthropology perspective. And our daughter Kerith, she's kind of the most probably outgoing, natural one of the lot. She was 9 months old when we arrived here, so she's probably as Texan as anybody else does. And she said she wasn't going to go to private high school, so she went to Hillcrest around the corner here. Loved every minute of it, did all the cheerleading issues and things like that, and finally got married when she was 32, and she and her husband live in Hermosa Beach near Manhattan Beach in California, and they have a business there, and she works now part-time with a little baby.
What type of business do they have?
They have a special car rental business and she also works as a manager for a store that sells children's clothing.
Terrific. So you're still very actively involved in the medical profession?
Probably too, at my tender age, probably more than I should be. I initiated an international group of psoriasis, which is the disease that our family actually has, that I kind of spend most of my time working on research-wise and teaching-wise. So I started a group called the International Psoriasis Council back about 9 years ago, which is hopefully the leaders in the world of dermatology relating to psoriasis research and treatment. And it got a lot bigger than I thought it would, so I still travel to Latin America a few times a year, to Asia Pacific and to Europe, and of course across the US, teaching and putting meetings together. And we just had an event a month ago where they had a lifelong achievement award for myself here in Dallas, where we had about 300-400 people show up, and they used me as a vehicle to raise money for research, and we raised over $1 million for psoriasis research and fellowships.
Fantastic.
So that was kind of a nice culmination.
What do you do when you're not working? Or is there ever a time when you're not working?
Well, like everybody, I suppose I'm overly committed to what I love to do.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I say I'm going to slow down, Pam says, what are you going to do if you slow down? I'm very involved in politics. I love international politics. So I collect first edition books of African explorers that I've got a collection of, which unfortunately I haven't read most of them. But everywhere I go, I try to look for that. And my wife is a lace maker, so she collects antique lace bobbins. So when we travel, we try to collect lace bobbins from, say, Belgium, from France, or from different parts of Europe. And every now and again, I find a book in some obscure place that I can put into my library. So one day, hopefully, when I do slow down, I'll be able to involve myself more in that.
Terrific. Is there anything that you'd like to add that we haven't asked you about that you think would be important as part of the legacy for your children to remember about you and for the community to know about you?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think I miss my rugby, which I played international rugby for South Africa. There was only 10 Jewish people who ever played rugby for South Africa, very much the Afrikaner sport. Mm-hmm. And about 7-8 years ago, they had a special event in Cape Town at the Jewish Museum in Cape Town, where they put, and they use it as a fundraiser for Israel, they put together history and pictures of all the 10 Jewish South Africans who played rugby for the country. And that was a very special event that I went back to, and I've got a picture, probably the main picture in our clinic, in our teaching clinic, in our residency program that we run at Baylor, which shows the 10 Jewish Springboks there, and people who know nothing about rugby still want to know what that's all about. So that was a very special event in my life.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Anything else?
No, I think I've probably given you background and
Names of your daughter-in-laws, your grandchildren's names, where they go to school.
okay. Well, what I haven't mentioned is obviously my dear daughter-in-law who lives here, Jenny, who comes from Jay and I, who comes actually from Nevada. Keith was teaching at University of Nevada, UNLV, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. When he was teaching English and writing, he met Jenny there as a student, and they came back here, and I adore Jenny, and that they gave us our first grandchild, who's a little daughter now, who's called, they found her name Pruitt, which I never found out where they found Pruitt from, but she's just about ready to turn 3, and she lives here in Dallas, so she's somebody that we love to see home on weekends. And then our daughter Kerith, who went to California, her husband's name is Carl. He was at Hillcrest High School here with them, and they have a little daughter they named after Pamela's mother from Scotland, called Annabella. So what Pruitt, I've always called Pruitt's Pee because she's, Kerith, my daughter, was precious pie from day one. Because I grew up with 4 boys, 4 brothers, and we then had 2 brothers. I never thought I'd ever see a little girl in the house. So from day one, Kerith was my precious pie. I called her precious pie. So I now call her little baby Pee too, which I thought is a nice analogy for precious pie. And
What is your daughter's married name? Her last name?
oh, she still maintains the Menter, but she's taken the kind of a double name of her husband who came from Argentina called Alvizu.
Alvisa.
Yeah, so it's Kerith Menter Alvizu. And we're going to spend Thanksgiving there this year for the first time because she doesn't want to travel with a little baby, so all of us are going out there.
Terrific.
Yeah, she's rather special in my life, as is my wife Pam, who's done a remarkable job in keeping me in line and putting up with all my travel and all my sporting activities.
Well, I think you've given us a terrific insight into your life, into your family history, into the wonderful things that you've done, and your family as well. And I really want to thank you for the time that you've taken. I know that your schedule is very hectic, and it's very special to have had you with us this evening. Thank you so much.
Well, it's
Dr.
truly an
Menter.
honor. Thank you for inviting me. I really do appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Of my 3 brothers, one has remained in South Africa, that's Brian. And he is well, fortunately he's 2 years younger than I am. And he has 2 daughters, one of whom has 2 children of her own. And then my other 2 brothers, Robbie is one here. Robbie is the next one. Robbie lives in Dallas. He came a few years after we arrived. And Robbie has 2 kids, and his daughter has 5 children. Joanne went through in vitro, had a set of twins, went through in vitro again, we had another set of twins, and then spontaneously had a 5th child. So she has 5 children, and then
Okay.
Joanne Menter is the one who has the 5 children, and her, let's see, Robbie got divorced from his wife about 15 years ago, I think. That her name was Robin, and he's never remarried. And the saddest part of the whole thing is my little brother Malcolm, or Mandy as we called him, was 10 years younger than I am, and he started Busybody, the home exercise equipment company here. And then after he sold that out and was playing lots of golf, he decided to get into the cooking, which he loved to do, so he bought cowboy chicken. And he had 3 kids, none of whom live here. One lives in Austin, and her son lives in New York, and the other daughter lives close to my daughter in California. And Jill is this lovely, his wife is one of the loveliest people in the world, and she's been a very close friend ever since he died, which was exactly 5 years ago. He had cancer, and we went all over the world looking for a very rare form of cancer. And sadly, he died, as I said, 5 years ago. Had a very tough last couple of years. He was almost like our first child, because when my father died and I was 19, Malcolm was 9. And then he came to live with Pam and I a year after we got married, and he lived in our house, went to high school for his last couple of years of high school. So when our 2 kids were born, Malcolm was kind of the elder brother, even though he was elder brother to them, even though he was 10 years younger than I was. So I adored Malcolm. He was very close.
Thank you.
Okay. So when I arrived here in 1975, working as a research fellow and teacher at UT Southwestern, I worked part-time Saturdays, for instance, with Carmen Jacobson, who was kind of the guru of dermatology here. And Carmen was very, very good to me. He helped me kind of get started, introduced me to lots of people. And then when I started getting more involved in research, that's when I started my own clinic and started the residency program and fellowship program at Baylor. And sadly, Carmen died just recently at the age of 91. He was a remarkable man, Carmen was. And he had family and contacts back in South Africa as well. So he used to like to go to South Africa. Which is owned by L'Oreal, and is probably considered the biggest pure dermatology pharmaceutical company worldwide. Their North American headquarters are in South Lake here. So they gave $150,000 to the event in my honor, which I thought was very, because I do a lot of research for them. So that was pretty special.
Yasher Koach.
Talk about that event so I can get the whole event on video.
Well, 1 year ago, the National Psoriasis Foundation, which is the largest patient organization in the world dedicated to psoriasis treatment and research and educating patients about a disease that affects 120 million people worldwide and about 7 million people in the US, they decided to give me a Lifetime Achievement Award for whatever work I'd done in the teaching and research of psoriasis. We discovered the first gene for psoriasis in 1994 that we published in the Journal of Science with my colleagues from UT Southwestern and our Psoriasis Center at Baylor. So I'd been working in the field of research and treatment, and I started this international research group, as I said, about 7 years ago, International Psoriasis Council. So they decided to put this event together and to try and raise money for fellowships and for teaching and for research in the world of psoriasis. And I was the honoree and got this award. And so for a year we went to patients, we went to foundations, we went to the pharmaceutical companies to try and raise money. And we had an 18-year-old patient of mine from El Paso, Texas, who came to me when she was 10, drove with her mom 600 miles to see me because she had total body psoriasis and was devastated and was being kicked out of school and had no friends. And we fortunately were able to get her clear, and she stood up at this gala event, a little short, 5 foot tall, and gave a 15-minute history of her life with psoriasis and where she is today. And there was not a dry eye in the place when she was finished talking. And the donations went up considerably after they'd listened to her.
Did you cure her?
Yeah, she's totally clear at the present time, yes.
Because of your research?
Well, I hope that played a little role in helping her, yep.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So before you started your research, tell us what it was like for a psoriasis patient.
Well, it was pretty tough because it's such a visible disease, and you could never wear black because your hair is always pouring out scale, and you've got these big patches on your elbows and knees and different parts of your body, and you may or may not get arthritis with it as well, which some people get. So in the old days when I grew up with psoriasis, which was putting people into hospital and wrapping them up in tar wraps and creams and things like that, and then cortisone creams came about, and that helped a little bit, but it never cleared the condition properly. So it's only in the last 10, 15 years, or probably 20 years, that we now have both tablets as well as injectable agents, which we call biologic agents, that can clear the vast majority of patients and give them a free life. I can tell you the suicidal ideation in young people with psoriasis is twice as high as any other chronic disease because of the visible nature. They can't, they sit at home, they can't go to the gym, can't go to the public pool or any swimming pool, they don't want to put on shorts. So it's a very devastating disease, and for people who have kids, they can't go and do things with their kids the way you and I would like to, just because they have to hide it all the time. And I've had families where different members of I've had a husband and wife, where the wife who had psoriasis never told her husband, and she never changed in front of him all their life because she was so ashamed of her disease. She waited for him to get into bed before she went to bed. Never ever showered, or never let him see her because of her psoriasis. And once we cleared her, their life became dramatically better. I work very closely with some of the major pharmaceutical companies, for instance, Johnson & Johnson, Amgen Corporation, Galderma, Genentech, some of the big companies. And I was often the person that they would come and speak to because of starting a new trial for a new drug. And I was what's called principal investigator for two of the four drugs that are now out. Helped them create it and help them develop it, and so the rest is history. We're still developing new drugs and hopefully cures finally. I do get people from probably every state in the US, although I now have colleagues that do what I do in certain centers around the country. I get a lot of people coming in from Latin America, and I do have people even from the Middle East, from some of the neighboring countries to Israel actually. They come in because I've met their dermatologists at different meetings, and I've helped them produce guidelines for different countries. I get patients from the Far East, from Malaysia, and they come in and I help their dermatologist get them started on what I think is the most appropriate treatment. And then they go back to their dermatologist. I do a lot of work online for them, which people are sending me emails and pictures and asking me to help. So I'm always happy to do that. Doesn't pay very well, it doesn't pay at all, but I enjoy it.
So you're a world-leading authority.
That's why you got the honor. Terrific. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for adding.
Not at all. Thank you for asking me those questions. When we came to Dallas, Pam had learned to make lace. She was always very, very gifted with the use of her hands, doing different needlework. But when we were in London, she went to a lace school. She was probably the youngest person by 40 years at the lace school. And then when she came to Dallas, after she'd built up a collection of antique lace bobbins from different parts of Europe, mainly Brussels, Belgium, she started a lace school here. She started the first lace school here in Dallas and has taught a number of people to make antique lace.
What does she do with the lace at home?
She gives lace presents out to different people, and she has a collection of antique lace bobbins that is rather remarkable. Some of the lace bobbins going back a couple hundred years with the original lace maker's name etched into the ivory or to the wood that of the antique lace bobbins. But she makes tablecloths, and she keeps them at the house and stores them and gives gifts to friends and different people.